love writing tests, and I had a conversation with her about this earlier, and she had kind of a wide variety of topics she wanted to cover, and obviously 5-10 minutes is, you got to keep it tight. So she's going to talk about how testing went from feeling like a chore, which I'm sure all of us have felt like that, to how testing turned her into a more empathetic programmer. So Sienna, go ahead and take it away, please.
Thanks for the introduction, Dan. I'll share my screen here. Let's make sure I share the right one. Great. Can you see that okay? Everybody can see and hear? Perfect. Well, I'm Sienna Kopf. Pronouns are she, her, and I'm from the Turing backend program for 2005. And this is learning to love writing tests through the lens of a passionate new developer. Just a little bit of background on me. I would characterize myself as a competitive climber first. I've got Olympic aspirations for Paris 2024. And only recently would I add software developer to my title. 7 months ago, I started the Turing program, and tomorrow I graduate. So that's kind of crazy that it's already over. But I think what drew me to software was the flexible job environment and the ability that I would have to fund my climbing aspirations. But as I traversed through the program, I really realized that this is something that I have a passion for. So it kind of went beyond just something for the lifestyle, and it's really something that I truly love. Coding for me, it's fulfilling, it's mentally stimulating, and it's challenging. It's also rhythmic and relaxing, and it turned out that it was the perfect balance to the perfect complement to the climbing I do and the training I do for that. Jumping back into the coding side, I'm going to talk a little bit about my experience with testing as I went through Turing from day one to, I guess, today, near the end of the program. So starting with a Ruby repository called Mythical Creatures. That was kind of like my first experience writing in Ruby. I wrote my first methods, I wrote my first classes, and I achieved my first mini test, fabulous run. And this is kind of where it all started. I practiced TDD, working off of pre-built testing suites for each creature. And I quickly picked up on the class building patterns of Ruby, using the verbose error messages that it sends, as well as all of the documentation on Google to guide that process. And this was really effective for me. I constructed class after class after class after class with relative ease. Here's a couple screenshots from numerous projects during the first quarter of the Turing program. During this time, I continued to practice TDD, but I started to kind of rush through the process. I never stopped, or after the first few times going through the class building process, I didn't really need to read the error messages that it was throwing, because I already knew what next steps to take with my code. And it felt pretty redundant. It was hard for me to understand why I had to write so many tests when I already knew what I had to write in the code. Luckily for me, we didn't spend too long just writing classes, and we kind of quickly graduated towards building real Rails applications. This meant transitioning from mini test to RSpec, introducing more structural components, including controllers, models, views, and the occasional poro. And the test suite size exploded. On the left there is my first Ruby on Rails application, and on the right is my second. By my second Ruby on Rails application, the test suite was deeply nested, it was poorly organized, and it was very hard for me to navigate. Ultimately, testing was a chore. I appreciated the error handling and feature maintenance that came with writing those tests, but testing was absurdly time-consuming and obnoxiously redundant. And my inability to navigate those testing suites was obstructing my understanding of Rails applications as a whole. At this point, I really was only writing the tests to meet project requirements as of Turing in order to advance to the next quarter. So I didn't really feel like I was understanding why I was spending all of this time writing all of these tests for a long time. 4 months into the program, we finally got to what I consider the heart of backend development, building and consuming APIs. And this is something I really enjoyed. Lots of what I had learned already about Ruby and about Rails started to synthesize for me. And my reasonable proficiency up to this point allowed me to dig a little bit deeper. I started to push for more than just functional features. I wanted to achieve more with my applications in terms of like organization and use. So I worked hard to understand and leverage the architectural components of Ruby on Rails, pushing functionality out of the controllers and encapsulating that code into appropriate file categories like facades, services, poros, and serializers. And I worked to pull those explicit organizational strategies into my test suite as well, shown there on the right in the screenshot, effectively creating kind of a reflection of my application in detailed tests. Beyond that, I also started to take an interest in the details of those tests, specifically making an effort to write verbose test descriptions using the describe and it blocks built into RSpec. These like English and grammatically correct sentences made it really easy for me to track where to add features and how to describe the function of those features in my programs. I have an example in there of a user registration endpoint on an API that I built. So when I wanted to add another SAD path, or if I wanted to update that feature, it was really easy for me to navigate to that test and see where I needed to make those changes. All of this it was evident to me that the effort I was putting into that organization was allowing me to easily navigate and add features to my application. And that's kind of when my understanding of testing started to shift, because I was starting to understand the use case of this tool. For me, testing was clearly now a mode of communication. It maintained the characteristic of my previous conceptualization of error handling, feature maintenance, and redundancy, but it also expanded in my head as I realized that tests could act as guidelines of return and a guide to the program as a whole. I started to use my test suite to guide my development, easily adding tests for the next feature and building the code from there, which made it easier to practice good TDD principles. I also started to collaborate with designated front-end teams just in the last 6 weeks. And it really clicked for me that one of the main reasons to write tests is to explicitly express and verify the return of backend endpoints in order to work effectively with a front-end team and create an effective application in the end. Not only that, but it was also clear to me that communicating well through tests and through other methods was pivotal to being an empathetic developer, something Turing had tried to tell me for months and that I didn't fully understand until around 6 weeks ago. Kind of going into developer empathy, what is that? In my interpretation, that's working as a developer to mitigate the challenges that other developers will face when using your applications. And for me, this means that your code has to speak for itself. It has to communicate effectively to developers of many skill levels from many backgrounds, and there has to be an ease of use for those adding and maintaining the code. It's pretty clear that writing verbose, organized, and thorough tests is necessary when considering code in an empathetic manner. And when I think about my experience in learning Ruby and Ruby on Rails, the most accessible resources were the ones with the best documentation and the clearest testing, because even with limited experience, I could still pull functional knowledge from those resources. As I start my professional career, as I get involved in open source, as I build passion projects for the climbing community, testing is one of my priorities. Beyond that, I want to prioritize writing organized code with thorough documentation while practicing professional Git workflow and verbose communication in many forms. It is clear to me now that conscious effort in these areas as I continue to advance my technical knowledge will allow me to become a more empathetic developer. It's just as clear that although testing was the first domino in my understanding, it's certainly not the last. And I look forward to finding processes that I love just as much as testing. That's it. You can find me on Slack, GitHub, email, etc. Happy to field any questions if anyone has any.
Yeah, I just say you mentioned documentation. I think you didn't necessarily mean if documentation was like the unit test. You actually meant like documentation of really the empathy and stuff like that. But like
Yes.
in my mind, like today I even had the issue where like it's literally I debugged this today. If for mobile and field category head link do something or something else. If there was a freaking test to document what that meant, I would have known. I have no idea. I have to go talk to the person tomorrow. It's depressing. So I'm just saying that unit tests are such great documentation as well of how stuff's supposed to work.
Absolutely. I was referencing like separate documentation, but I think it ties into testing really well as well. Testing is its own form of documentation of the sorts.
Hey, Sienna, can you talk about, like, was there like one moment where like, oh, this all clicks, or was it like, what was the process like? Can you talk about the process in like general, like, hey, this is kind of how I got empathy, or how it kind of drove home to me that testing is not a chore? But was there like a crystallizing moment for you?
There actually kind of was. I was building an API as part of my last project of Mod 3. That's the third quarter out of 4 of the Turing program. And I had a conversation with like the director of the backend engineering program. And that conversation, we started to dive into like the idiosyncrasies of the code. And I was pushed to articulate the design choices I made. And the design choices of the file structure, the design choices of the organization, and the design choices of like my testing suite. And that's kind of when it all clicked. Like I had worked really hard up to that point, and I was starting to understand how that tied into developer empathy. But it was that moment where I had to think on my feet and articulate those thoughts that it kind of really like made sense to me. And then like since then, I've been even more motivated to incorporate that into my projects in many different ways, not only in testing, but also in like the documentation side and all sorts of things, because it was a little bit more clear of the use case of that.
I don't really have a question. I just wanted to say, you know, thank you for presenting. And also, you know, you highlighted a lot about just test as communication and communicating design decisions. And I think that is something that is, it's sometimes hard to explain to people like how important that is. And sometimes you can come into organizations where they haven't done a lot of robust tests, and it makes it very hard to learn the system. And I think the fact that you talked about that as just like a net good is really great. And also thank you so much for presenting and you know, thank you.
Yeah, I think that it's really cool to see a talk like this because, you know, when I started learning Ruby like 7 or 8 years ago, everyone was like, you aren't going to believe how into testing everyone is. And it's cool to see that like that is still the spirit of this community. And I think if you talk to programmers outside of the Ruby community, it is shocking how much this is not the case when it's like almost a default for us in the Ruby and Rails world. Yeah, it's a real luxury that we have in our community for sure.
Is that something you feel like you can encourage if you're working in different languages and frameworks and companies that don't have as robust of testing? Or do you think it's a little bit harder to break into that?
I feel like a curmudgeon because I would have said yes in the past, but I think that it's ultimately a cultural thing, and that's the hardest thing to change.
So
I have opinions on that, actually.
I also have opinions on this, but Dan, go ahead, because I've talked enough. I've talked like a lot over the last 3 hours. So
No worries. I mean, I just feel like I've been in places where there were no tests and it was a big system, and it happened to be a Java shop, right? It doesn't really matter what it was. There's no technical barriers to this, right? Like I think Joel hit the nail on the head. It's a cultural thing, but the journey of 1,000 miles starts with one single footstep. And I just started like to write tests for my stuff. And you know what? It was not perfect. It wasn't anywhere near where it needed to be, but it felt so good for me to like bring that sensibility. And I have no idea whether those tests are still maintained. I've moved on, but I always think that as a developer, we should try to elevate wherever we go. And a super simple way to do that is to just write tests.
Yeah, there's also like a key thing I've seen. It's a bit of a sharp tool, but using something like SimpleCov. We did it early on a couple projects that I've been doing for work, and you just have the build fail if you don't have test coverage.
Yeah.
And then and then it's no longer cultural. You're just like, okay, we started this new thing. We're going to have 100% coverage. And it's not perfect, but it gets people like, what that does is it means that most PRs will fail unless you wrote new tests.
Yeah. So I have a little bit of a different experience. My first job ever was in Ruby using Rails and also using .NET, and nothing was tested. There were no tests for anything. And I had come from learning Rails from a TDD mindset and like having done like online courses for Rails. And I was very much into that. And I ran into a lot of roadblocks, like trying to convince people. And I think it's hard to show somebody that testing is worth it in the moment. And it's easier to show them that it's worth it in retrospect. But like the biggest thing that I was able to do is at that job, I was essentially put in charge of a project. And I said like, well, if I'm in charge of the project, I negotiated this with my manager. I didn't just go rogue, I should say that. But I like basically said like, if I'm in charge of this project, like I want to do tests. I want to do TDD. And this was it wasn't even a Ruby project. It was a .NET project, which testing in .NET is like, now it's a lot better. Back then it was not great. And I just said, this is what I want to do. And they said like, okay, well, we'll let you do that, but you're going to have to check in. Like at every check-in, we might decide that it's not worth it. And I said, fine, that's fine. Check-ins were once a week. And I essentially convinced them to like go a couple weeks. But once I could show them, like once I could like just write, like at one point my manager paired with me and like wrote tests with me and like saw me working through stuff and then saw me deploying stuff and then saw me like make a change where some other test broke. And he was just kind of like, this actually makes a lot of sense. I just didn't understand what you meant, right? Like he had never been exposed to it, or people don't understand what it's worth. And like, again, this is also like, what is it? It's 2020. So this is like 10 years ago. But I mean, I do think that like the results do kind of speak for themselves a little bit. Like if you can demonstrate value, people are more receptive.
I think the fundamental thing you'll see that like maybe to echo what Elise said is that tests are perhaps the common denominator for most of our experiences with technical debt. So like the lack of tests is often one of the more like common technical shortcomings that you'll see in code bases. It's like super, super common. Every code base I've been in, like fundamentally the testing issue has been like a reflection of like other technical issues. So you can use that as a way to judge code bases that you might be working in. I mean, the GitHub code base, I think we're at like 12 years old now, and we are paying the price of a lack of test coverage for sure. We only did happy path testing for like 8 years. And that worked really well for a while. But now that we want to like rewrite everything because we're scaling so much, it's really bad. I guess what I'm getting at is it's like the easiest thing ever to not do, because like it's very easy in the moment or in the month for like to just not do it.
Yeah.
And then you build your culture around it, and then you end up in a bad place.
Cool. Jumping in.
Ryland's cutting us off.
Yeah. I think that was really great, Sienna. Thank you. And good conversation afterwards. I'm sure we could talk about testing and everything for the rest of the whole night. Super great though. Thank you for your time and effort. And I think that was really interesting to listen to.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed talking.